All right, we are live. Welcome. My name is Lorenz, and this is a continuation of our Creator Conversation series from Sutra.co. And I am very happy to be with Amrit Singh Khalsa today, who is the CEO of the Kundalini Research Institute, known to many as KRI. He's been involved with the Kundalini Yoga community since 1989 and just has a wealth of insight and wisdom around the reality of community and what it takes to create conversations in communities. So, Amrit, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Lorenz. Nice to be here.
Yeah, and I'd love to start just to have you share a little bit about the community that you oversee, just to give some context to our conversation.
Yeah, sure. So, KRI has several, um, let's say, rings amongst our constituency. The most broad level is we're here with tools and information for anyone interested at all about Kundalini Yoga. Uh, we have the library of teachings. We publish books available to anyone who practices or is interested in practicing. Then a little bit more focused group are all the people who have participated in and taken one of our worldwide teacher training courses. So there are thousands of um, courses, thousands of trainers, teachers who've been certified over the years. Um, and then the most inner group of our community would be our teacher trainers. So we have about 800 around the world. So these are people who spent years becoming yoga teachers, getting practical experience, and then have chosen to say, oh, we want to now train the next generation of teachers. So we have a whole program of mentorship and experience gathering for those people to become KRI teacher trainers.
Hmm. And with this top level of the teacher trainers, what are some of your aspirations as far as what might be called community building?
Well, we are an interesting group, let's say, of kind of loosely connected. They're not employees, they're not like business people, or we are not like a business that everyone must sort of take orders from a boss.
Mhm.
Um, these are people who are out there serving and want to do it kind of in their way and are choosing to be part of this global school of the Kundalini Research Institute. So we want people to feel that they have a voice in how things are run and how they happen, and that what does KRI stand for? What does a KRI certificate stand for? Why should they choose to be part of this group? Well, there's certain standards, for quality of the trainers, for the curriculum, so that if you took a course in Kuala Lumpur or in Santiago, they're going to be similar. You could do your first course in Los Angeles and then take parts of your second level course in Paris or Paraguay or Beijing. So,
Mm.
um, how do you keep that global school together? How do you get these 800 people continuing to have high quality courses as the world changes, like recently going online, sharing best practices, as well as um, some level of, let's say, um, top down, okay, here's a new policy, here's a new quality standard that people need to learn and then adhere to. So we're trying to have people of all these different cultures with all these different languages with a common goal of training the next generation of Kundalini yoga teachers in a high quality, standardized way. Um, yeah, how do we work together? How do we agree on those standards that work
Mhm.
in all the different places?
And what are some of the biggest things that have shifted for you since the pandemic hit in this effort?
Well, 2020 was a big challenge with the pandemic closing down almost all in-person yoga classes.
Hmm.
So there were people in the midst of their teacher trainings that stopped or had to figure out how to move online. Um, so with all that chaos of from the COVID, yeah, just a huge drop in the number of people practicing.
So that you're saying the one of the biggest challenges is just that a lot of your teacher trainers all of a sudden lost a lot of their business.
That and yeah, needing to adapt to online. So some teacher
Mm-hmm.
trainers just chose to wait. I'm going to not teach online.
Mm-hmm.
Others jumped in and found ways to move their training online. Others um, figured out even better ways to do it online. Not just, okay, I'm going to put a camera in front of me and do everything exactly as I used to do it, but what can I do in a pre-recorded way? Other resources can I put online that my students can benefit from in between the live
Mm-hmm.
sessions, right? So yeah, a
Now
lot of
I know that pre-pandemic there was some restrictions on delivering a full level one teacher training,
mhm.
but recently I believe I've seen people offering like level one teacher trainings in what seems an entirely online format. So I'm curious, has the policy around that shifted, or what's kind of emerged around this concept of delivering the training and the standards of that training in what might possibly be a purely online format?
Yeah, well, so we certainly adapted. We opened it up to online. We said from the beginning the preference was to keep some in person if possible, and we said if it's not possible to have any amount online, we asked people to be in dialogue with us to talk about how they were going to handle some of the subtle or more sort of tricky parts to move online, but we allowed it. Um, and we kind of gave ourselves a experimental or information gathering phase. So over the last 2 years, we were talking with those who jumped in. We're actually right in the middle now as a community of proposing a more permanent approach to online trainings, which would be similar to what we started with, that in certain circumstances we will allow 100% online, um, but it needs to be kind of thought through and more careful, that in person and hybrid are preferable when possible.
Hmm. And do you have a sense of, I guess the word might be like the efficacy of delivering a purely online training versus in person? I mean, specifically related to the level one teacher training. Like, have you guys kind of generated any sort of like, I don't know, metrics or however you might measure, whether or not this is a good way to deliver the training?
We don't really have a metric for it.
Hmm.
What makes one teacher better than another, let's say.
Right, right. Hmm.
um, but we think that there are advantages to online. It works for some people's schedule, for how they learn. Now that many yoga teachers have to be online, being trained online, right, can make them better as online teachers. Um, but it has some disadvantages. And part of our practice, it's not just, well, go to a gym and move your body in the right way. There's a deeply spiritual component. There's subtleties that we really try to focus on in our teacher training, and community. Connecting with community is a part of the training, and that can have challenges online. So
Hmm.
we still feel that, and if it is online 100%, that you get a good teacher training and can be an excellent teacher afterwards. And our preference would be to be in person, at least some, if you can.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, have you guys generated any kind of specific approaches to or structures for hybrid models, or is that kind of up to each teacher to figure out?
Yeah, each teacher trainer has been
Hmm.
experimenting with that. Um,
Hmm.
we at CareI, we run our own training. So this is one of the big reasons, so that we can be experimenting and directly learning what's working and what isn't. We've done a model as a hybrid where it starts online. So people are meeting like 3 weekends a month for 5 months, and then end with a in-person retreat
Hmm.
for 10 days. And that's seem to be worked well for us.
Yeah, I'm curious because you mentioned you guys are learning I'm curious, what is that process of prototyping for you like? Like when you say that you've been learning about approaches to delivering the training online, with your KRI trainings, like how do you how is there are there any highlights around how you've approached that process to kind of be like, okay, the world is changing, everything is going online, everybody is online. In fact, there's no other option. I mean, up until very recently.
Mm-hmm.
How are we going to take this, like, very traditional body of work and bring it into this format? Was it just kind of like stepping into it? Was there, a method to the madness? Like anything about how you approach that actual process?
Um, I mean, I would say we're in a very lucky position having this global school. So we've got all these teacher trainers who were doing their own experiments and having the chance to talk with them. I'm literally just asking, what
Mm,
worked? What did you find? Oh, did
mm,
that go
mhm,
well? What were the hard parts? Well, just so conversations with others who've done it. And then we had our own internal then discussion. So kind of learn from there and then talk through, well, how are we going to address, how do you adjust people's postures? How can you tell on Zoom?
mm,
How do you have them practice teach? How do you teach mantra pronunciation?
mm,
Right, with on Zoom, um, so we would just have our internal conversation of how we're going to address the sticky points and these challenging points came from what other people have learned and then what worked or
mm.
didn't work for them in addressing it.
And I just want to ask you a couple more questions here because I want to give some context. A big part of what we share is really methodologies around prototyping. So this is a subject of like really deep, intense interest for me. Is you're looking at kind of taking a body of work, bringing it into a new format, and of course maintaining the integrity of it, the standards of it, also the relational aspects of it, the community aspects of it. So it's really fascinating to me how you've approached that process. And I guess my other question here is, in terms of that data gathering process, and what I'm hearing is that it was very conversational, talking with different teacher trainers that were prototyping and experimenting on their own, and gathering that data. Was that conversational process structured, or more just kind of loose and intuitive, where different people on your staff would have those conversations and then you'd kind of come together and have a conversation to discuss? Or was this some kind of like structured like documentation around these different conversations, or more kind of analytical analysis?
That was fairly unstructured. I think we did
Mm,
ask some slightly more specific, let's say, questions of like, which sections did you find challenging, right? And then we could see the commonalities or not among
mm,
what part of the curriculum people might have had challenges with. But um, beyond that, no.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I'll also share that for most of our program prototyping, it's pretty unstructured. I mean, it's pretty kind of just gathering the data, and something about it sinks in and gives you an intuitive sense of direction. But I know for some people it can be super data oriented, and some people are more kind of loose and intuitive about it. And that intuitive information is also data. It's also, I like to think, it's also very data oriented. So um, yeah, and I'd love to maybe just transition a little bit to, so we've talked a little bit about the journey of the teacher trainers and moving online, and what it takes, the experience of taking traditionally in-person program, something as expansive as a whole, teacher training program, and moving that online, to just the teacher trainer community themselves, and creating connection between that community. Um, Maybe just a few words about, what are some of the different ways that you connect that community? I mean, I know some of that happens through Sutra, some of it through Zoom. Anything you might share a little bit around just the different ways that conversations happen across this community of 800 teacher trainers.
Yeah, well, I think we used to have a model of um, just one or two in-person meetings a year, for in different regions, so that people would need to still travel in. Um, and then we added Sutra to give a online space, so it's more convenient and always there, right? So it didn't have to wait till, the one big meeting a year. People could be contributing all throughout. Then, especially with COVID, Zoom, the online meetings took off.
Mhm.
And we found, we could get the whole globe together for conversations. And we experimenting with, how do you work time zones, when you have people all over the world, um, and languages, and how many meetings to have that are both convenient but still get people to come. So now we're trying to go back to some in-person meetings, maybe once a year, in different regions, and several Zoom calls of kind of different sizes, kind of global, but then also smaller, more regional Zoom, and then Sutra as a dialogue discussion platform, again, that's always available.
Mhm. And how do you handle the language differences on a Zoom call?
We use the interpretation channels feature, right? So we
Mhm.
get people who are willing to translate, um, and then we'll prepare some slides in the beginning that have multiple languages, so that people get the instructions how to enter a translation channel. Um, and then generally our primary language is English still. But sometimes people will present in another language, and there'll be English even as a channel. When there
Mhm.
needs to be dialogue, we either have language specific breakout groups, if they're small, again, which is not ideal, right? Sometimes you'd like to have people from different languages in a small group, but we haven't solved that. There's now the new automatic subtitling feature of Zoom, which
Mhm.
we've been experimenting with. Uh,
Mhm.
but like for like Q&A sessions or something like that, again, we'll either have it translated, person speaks in German, a German translator into English, or use the chat. If they're shorter questions, people can type it in their language, and then an interpreter can type it in English in the chat, and then it can be answered in English and then
Mhm.
translated to each of the languages.
And do you guys have any particular process for harvesting what emerges out of those conversations, or somehow collecting? I'm assuming there's lots of people sharing. There might be some
Mhm.
specific topic, and then somehow capturing what emerges out of those conversations.
We do. We try when we plan these big meetings. Each section we will think through how to capture, and it'll be different in
Hmm.
each one, right? So if it's breakout rooms, we'll often ask for a note taker, and we'll just say, take the notes in your language, and then email them in. Um, we Sometimes, if it's more in a larger group discussion, we'll have a note taker in the big main group who's taking the notes, and even copying and pasting from the chat to capture that way. Um, yeah, sometimes we've recorded and then have someone kind of go back, but that's time consuming. So
Hmm.
yeah, usually it's either have a note taker in the small group. Um, Sometimes if we don't want all the detail, we'll ask the small groups to just report highlights or bullet points,
Hmm.
or we'll have someone
Hmm.
try to capture those when they report out. So it kind of depends on the topic and what the outcome is. Sometimes it's just dialogue, and um, again, we'll have a note taker who captures action items, right? It's like we want to just have a conversation, and it's not to capture any notes unless, part of the conversation is, what, it would be great if blah, blah, blah. And then we'll
Hmm.
capture those.
Hmm.
So, short answer, I think either ask them to take notes and submit them, or we have a
Hmm.
note taker who's engaged in the large group.
And I know you guys have been through a bit of a rough patch with the community over the last couple of years with the allegations around Yogi Bhajan, and I know that it's created a bit of a crisis in the community. So I'm curious what have you seen as the impact of that crisis, as far as just the ability to have conversations, and just some of the things that you've had to navigate as far as continuing dialogue, and connection and communication within this community.
Yeah, well, and the main thing is that going through any crisis, I would say, just really increases the need for constructive dialogue and conversation. You know, how are we going to adapt and deal with this? At least in our kind of community, that's not uh, very strongly, let's say, top down, where people need to volunteer to, need to choose to be part of the community. Um, yeah, staying together as a community has always been a strong value for us. So, um, more conversation. And then the challenge is, um, yeah, how to have those conversations in ways that support and strengthen the community. I'm sure you've seen, you can have a conversation that turns into, kind of a fight, and then the people never want to speak to each other afterwards, right? Or uh,
Mm.
that, like, that's not the kind of dialogue or conversation that we want to have if we can avoid it, right? We want to say, okay, even if we disagree, how can we be stronger for our differences? How can we be inclusive enough, big enough as a community, solid and strong enough as a community to embrace diversity, right? Embrace differences of opinion, be respectful of people who disagree, and then find creative ways to move forward. Like, that's not easy to find,
Hmm.
to let's say, as a meeting facilitator or a meeting planner, what are the right questions to ask? What are the processes to go through that would make, these 2 hour meetings or this in-person day together be constructive, be strengthening, as well as move the community forward, not just talk for talk's sake, but like, hey, we have to move towards decisions that we need to take as a community. So yeah, it's been challenging.
Mm. I wonder, are there any particular personal insights that have come up for you around some of the things you're talking about, around the how do you navigate a difficult conversation? How do you respond when um, when something might maybe feels like it's about to blow up in a space, and it gets really tense. Like what are what's some of the just your personal wisdom around navigating that has emerged for you over the last couple of years?
um, One thing that comes to mind is being really clear on the goal or the outcome that you're going for. There was something, we were asked by some consultants early on, uh, something along the lines of, how important is the community and the community staying together to you? Like,
Mm-hmm.
meaning, as an honest question, like, are you willing to do anything to keep the community together or not? Um, and so, if the goal of a conversation is to keep the community together, well, that's a really different goal than, I need to make a decision about this or this, right? So, some conversations we've had, we've really tried to push for some of the non-intuitive or harder for groups of humans to get to. Of, no, we want a creative conversation. We want to expand the decision space, not fall into a binary yes or no, or around this decision we can either do this or that. Well, how do we get into, and how do we get into some third or fourth or fifth idea that we haven't even thought of yet? Again, like, leverage that diversity into creativity. Those are
Mm-hmm.
nice in theory, you hard to do in practice. But back to your question, it's, if I'm not clear of the outcome I want, then it's easier to fall into these human, uh, traps is too strong a word, but into the human nature of, ooh, it's this or that, or I need to get to a decision, rather than, oh, well, we just need to stop now. Like, it's better to not have a decision, to shift modes, go into, again, a more open-ended dialogue or something, right? To
Mm-hmm.
strengthen the community, to keep the community. Other times you can't. Other times you need to say, this is a decision that, for whatever reason, is timely and has to be made now. And how do we do our best with limited information and limited time, and know that it may have some negative implications to the strength of the community?
Yeah, I mean, it's so amazing to me because this human nature aspect that you're talking about, it really is human nature. I mean, you're dealing with a community of pretty hardcore seasoned yogis. These are people that take on this journey of self-realization pretty seriously, and that you there might be this idea that when you bring a bunch of yogis together, they're all gonna, find a peaceful resolution, but that's not always the case. And so I find it really inspiring, that yeah, the challenge of navigating this community and keeping it together in a time of crisis. Um, and these conversations that you're talking about, are they usually facilitated? That maybe the more recent conversations you've had, are they usually facilitated? Have you facilitated some of them, or do you have like professionals facilitating them?
We've done some of both. Well,
Mm-hmm.
we've had some professionals facilitate where we felt it would be particularly challenging, or need a level of skill or neutrality that me or some of my co-workers might not be able to bring. We've done some facilitation. We've had some where we wanted to do small group dialogue, so we've done some small training. Like, we've kind of been embracing the circle approach. So it's a circle facilitation. So we've done some mini trainings, gotten a handful of people, enough to handle all the breakout rooms that we expect, and had them facilitate.
Mm-hmm.
Other conversations, we've said, again, like, all right, this is a small group breakout. No one is facilitating the 5 or the 6 of you, but here's some ground rules, and have them be mature enough to handle that. So we've done multiple types.
Any like specific activities that you've worked with? I'm curious if you guys like experimented with like any embodied practices or yogic practices, or like any specific activities you've worked with to generate intimacy or vulnerability or trust and connection in some of these conversational spaces.
Well, we always start and end our meetings meditating together in
Mm.
some way, to kind of try to create both a common vibration and a higher vibration, right? To help everyone who's there um, connect on that highest possible level. And then we have nothing I'm not remembering any specifics, but there's certainly been, let's say, discussion questions to try that we've sometimes started with, let's say, to try to open up what you're saying, like a trusting or a vulnerable space.
Mm-hmm. And to your point about being very clear on the outcome, do you clarify that intention to the group in a conversation like beforehand, and say the our intention here is to do blank, or something like that? Is that part of the process?
Yeah, or I would say I try to. A
Mm,
recent one that we held, I thought we had been clear, and then afterwards, there was some people who had feedback, and it was like, could have been addressed and made even better if the goal was um, heard better, uh,
mm,
had
mm.
done. So um, yeah, but we tried to.
Have you had any situations where things kind of really went south in a conversation? And I'm just curious, coming out of that kind of experience, like what are some of the learnings that you've had around what you would do differently next time?
We haven't had any real serious going south conversation.
Mm,
You know, people storming out of the Zoom room, or screaming and yelling at each other. Um,
mm,
but like, when we get to the end, like, of a meeting, kind of the feedback that we almost always do a survey when we have bigger, longer meetings, and we'll ask people what worked and what didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of looking for that. Did that space get open of
Mm-hmm.
being able to listen to, let's say, people with a different view of yours? So there were times when we didn't achieve that as well as we had hoped, where people might have said, I didn't feel safe in my small group to even share what I really felt, right? That to us is like we didn't do, as good a job as we could have. And then
Mm-hmm.
other meetings where we hear like, oh, I was able to be honest. I was able to hear someone else with a different view of mine and really understand them better than I did before. Like we go, great, that was a win.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, so I love what you highlighted there. As far as developing this capacity to listen to people with a different point of view, is that something that you offer guidance on, in opening up a conversation, or is it just kind of something you hope people will practice?
Some of both. I think
Mm-hmm.
uh, again in planning the meeting, any conversation like that will start off with some sort of framing, and again maybe an exercise beforehand. Um, so with various levels of being explicit that that's what we're hoping for. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think to some extent we always do. I think.
Mm-hmm. And the survey that you just talked about, that's a Zoom survey or a Google survey, or how are you collecting that data from people afterwards?
We've tended to use Google Forms, kind of at the very end of the meeting. Hey, if you would just
Mm-hmm.
take 2 minutes before you hang up. We found people like once they go away, they will tend to not do it. Um,
Mm.
so um,
That's a great idea to
yeah,
to get them to do the survey as part of their, before they exit the call.
yeah, that's what we've tried.
Yeah, I love that. So maybe just as we wrap up here, any advice that you might offer um, to somebody who's interested in creating conversations within a larger community? Like you've got a community of 800 people, and you had mentioned, before jumping on this call as we were prepping, just about the difference between, say, running a smaller community with maybe 100 people that are more closely, have more in common, and the challenge of running a bigger community with 800 people, where people may not be as closely aligned around something. So I wonder if you had one or two pieces of advice for someone else who's looking to build community with a larger body of people, what might it be?
Yeah, well, I mean, we engagement is key, right? If people aren't engaged, then you don't have much of a community. So, what will get your community engaged? Everyone these days seems busier and busier. Their uh, attention broken up into smaller and smaller pieces and overloaded with too many pulls on it. So, what will make them interested enough and care enough to take X number of minutes out of their time to participate in your community, whether on a Zoom call or on a Sutra thread or whatever it might be, um, and making that easy for them, engaging, interesting, tied in, and relevant. So those are the kind of questions that kind of we ask ourselves, like, um, how do we reach people where they're at, make it easy for them to participate, and even try to engage them in what we're talking about, right? So it is something that's meaningful to them.
Mm. Yeah, that's great advice. And I feel like it's part art, part science, because it's so specific to each group of people, each
Yeah,
community, to really understand what's meaningful to them. And ultimately that's what everything is about. Whether you're building a community or selling a product, it's really about deeply understanding what's meaningful to the people that you're serving. Yeah, Amrit, thank you so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate having a chance to unpack some of your experience over the last few years.
yeah, nice to talk to you.
Yeah, much love.